Long before the infant understands what another person is, before it can form words, before it has a stable sense of its own identity, it is already doing something psychologically remarkable. It is absorbing the patterns of those who care for it, the emotional textures of the people most present in its world, the characteristic ways of being of the figures it is most attached to. All of these are taken in, internalized, and gradually become part of the developing self. This fundamental process, the taking in of another person's qualities and making them one's own, is what Sigmund Freud called identification, and it is one of the most important mechanisms in his entire theory of psychological development. Freud introduced identification as a concept distinct from both imitation, the conscious copying of behavior, and object choice, the investment of libido in an external person. Identification is older and more fundamental than either. It is an archaic, partial, and largely unconscious assimilation of another person. When you identify with someone, you don't simply copy them. You take something of them inside yourself and it becomes part of how you are in the world, part of your emotional repertoire, your values, your characteristic responses to situations. Freud described several distinct forms of identification that operate across different developmental contexts. The most primitive is what he called oral or cannibalistic identification, the earliest form, in which the infant takes in the other person through the same oral modality that it uses to take in food. The self and the other are not yet clearly distinguished, and the other is assimilated as if by eating. This form of identification is completely unconscious and pre-verbal, but its effects on the developing personality can be deep and lasting. The most developmentally significant form of identification, and the one Freud discussed most extensively, is the identification that occurs during the resolution of the Oedipus complex. When the boy cannot sustain his rivalry with the father because of castration anxiety, he resolves the dilemma by identifying with the father, taking on the father's values, prohibitions, and authority, making them his own. This identification installs the superego, the internalized parental authority that monitors and regulates the ego's behavior. The child who could not have the mother instead becomes like the father. What was an external authority is transformed into an internal one. Girls, in Freud's account, undergo a parallel but differently structured identification process, identifying more gradually and less completely with the mother, in a process that Freud acknowledged he never fully understood. The identification involves taking in not the feared rival but the figure who, through her position in the family structure, represents the normative female identity that the girl is expected to inhabit. Identification with lost objects is another form Freud described with particular clinical acuity. In grief, and more pathologically in depression, the person who has lost a love object deals with that loss by identifying with a lost other, taking them inside through identification as a way of not losing them entirely. The widow who takes on her late husband's characteristic gestures, speech patterns, or values. The person in depression who attacks themselves as if they were attacking the person they have lost. These are identification-based processes in which the lost other has been internalized and now occupies a position within the self. In group psychology, as Freud analyzed it, identification operates at a social level. Group members identify with one another through their shared identification with the leader or group ideal. This horizontal identification creates the emotional bonds of solidarity that hold groups together. The implications of identification for understanding personality development are considerable. Much of what we think of as characteristically ours, our values, our emotional style, our relationship to authority and to ourselves, arrive through identification processes that were largely unconscious. We became who we are partly by absorbing others. Knowing this doesn't undermine the authenticity of our identities. But it does prompt the useful question, which of what I carry in myself do I choose to keep, and which belongs to identifications that no longer serve me? Subscribe to Psychology. Theories explained for more psychology breakdowns every week.